She sat in the break room corner, stirring powdered creamer into a styrofoam cup. Nobody looked at her twice. To the flight line crew, she was just the quiet desk clerk who filed maintenance logs. They had no idea the hands gripping that cheap coffee used to rip hornets through the stratosphere. If you spend enough time around regional airports, you learn to spot the ghosts. They are the people who have stopped waiting for their lives to begin. They wear faded polo shirts. They drink coffee that tastes like copper piping, and they blend into the background noise of auxiliary power units and idling baggage carts. Arthur Hayes was not a ghost, but he was getting close. At 58, with a bad knee and a worse divorce settlement, he captained a twin-engine bombardier for a feeder airline out of the American Southwest. It wasn't glamorous. He flew metal tubes full of tired businessmen between dusty secondary hubs. His layovers were spent in places like Red Mesa Regional, a slab of cracked concrete shared by a civilian terminal on one side and a sprawling, fenced-off military testing range on the other. That was where he first noticed Helen. Helen Brody worked the front desk of the fixed base operator, the small building where private pilots and corporate charters paid for jet fuel and bought stale vending machine snacks. She was, by all conventional metrics, entirely forgettable. She wore oversized beige cardigans, even in July. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unbothered clip. When the young loudmouth line mechanics tracked grease onto the linoleum, Helen didn't yell. She just quietly fetched the mop. Arthur spent a lot of time in that FBO waiting out weather delays. He was a cynical man, hardened by decades of dealing with incompetent dispatchers, FAA regulations, and passengers who treated flight attendants like dirt. He liked to sit in the corner leather chair, nursing a black coffee, and watch the world fail to impress him. He watched the line guys treat Helen like a piece of furniture. "Hey, Helen, print out the new weather packets," one of them would bark, tossing a clipboard onto her desk. "Sure, Todd," she'd reply, her voice barely a whisper. She never made eye contact. She just kept her head down, her fingers pecking at the outdated computer keyboard. Arthur figured she was a lifer. Someone who grew up in the scrub-brush towns around the airfield, took a job paying $2 over minimum wage, and just never left. He felt a brief, dull pang of pity for her. The world had chewed her up and spit her out behind a Formica desk. But then Arthur saw the hands. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. A mechanical issue with his starboard engine had grounded Arthur's flight. He was slumped in his usual chair in the FBO. Helen was behind the counter, organizing a stack of fuel receipts. Suddenly, the low, guttural roar of military afterburners shook the building. It wasn't an unusual sound at Red Mesa. The military airspace to the north was constantly active. But this sound was different. It was low. It was fast. It was right on top of them. The heavy glass windows of the FBO rattled in their frames. The coffee in Arthur's cup vibrated. A pair of F-18 Hornets tore across the civilian runway, maybe 1,000 feet off the deck, banking hard to the north. Most people in the room reacted exactly as you'd expect. Todd, the line mechanic, spilled his soda. A corporate pilot waiting for his passengers flinched and ducked his head. Arthur himself tensed up, his eyes darting to the ceiling. Helen didn't flinch. Arthur watched her. She had stopped sorting the receipts. She stood perfectly still behind the counter. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes tracking the invisible path of the jets through the acoustic ceiling tiles. She wasn't just listening to the noise, she was analyzing it. Arthur noticed her right hand resting on the countertop. Her fingers were curled slightly, mimicking a grip. As the roar of the jets faded and the sound shifted in pitch, Helen's wrist made a microscopic adjustment. A slight pull backward, a fractional twist. It was the muscle memory of a pilot pulling a stick back into a high G turn. Arthur frowned. He was a pilot. He knew what that hand gesture meant. But before he could process it, the moment passed. The jets vanished into the horizon. Helen blinked. Her shoulders slumped back into their usual defeated posture, and she returned to sorting the receipts as if nothing had happened. Arthur told himself he was imagining things. The desert heat made you see what wasn't there. She was a desk clerk, probably just startled by the noise. He didn't think about it again for another 3 weeks, not until the sky over Red Mesa decided to try and kill a couple of Navy kids. Aviation weather in the desert is a liar. It will give you severe clear skies for 72 hours straight, lulling you into a false sense of security. And then it will drop a haboob, a massive wall of dust and wind, mixed with a violent squall line directly on top of your runway. It happened on a Friday evening. Arthur's flight was canceled before he even got to the plane. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Arthur retreated to the FBO, joining a handful of stranded corporate pilots, a couple of frustrated mechanics, and Helen, who was quietly wiping down the coffee station. The aviation band radio on the front desk was crackling with static. The local air traffic controller, a guy named Miller who usually handled nothing more complex than a Cessna, doing touch and goes, was sounding increasingly stressed. Red Mesa Tower was not equipped for heavy instrument traffic in zero visibility conditions. Arthur stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass in horizontal sheets. The wind was howling, a steady 40 knots gusting to 60. Suddenly, the scanner on Helen's desk spat out a frantic, clipped transmission. Mayday, Mayday, Red Mesa Tower. This is Outlaw 11, Flight of 2. We are blind in the soup, declaring an emergency. Say you're active. Arthur turned from the window. The chatter in the room died instantly. Every pilot in the FBO knew what a Mayday call meant. Outlaw 11. This is Red Mesa Tower. Miller's voice came back, trembling. I have you on radar. You are 20 miles north. Be advised. Red Mesa is currently IFR. Visibility is 1/4 mile. Wind is 040 at 45. My tower, Outlaw 11. We are bingo fuel. Lost our primary nav. Lead has a hung main gear. We cannot divert. We are putting them down on your strip. Give me vectors for an ILS approach. Arthur swore under his breath. F-18s. They had to be. They had probably been caught in the squall line over the training range, burned too much gas fighting the headwind, and now they were out of options. A hung gear meant the landing wheels weren't locking into place. Landing a heavy, fast jet in a crosswind with a hung gear and zero visibility was a death sentence. Miller, the local controller, was completely out of his depth. Outlaw, hold your position. Climb to 5,000. Let me check the runway status. We might have debris on runway 29er. Arthur's blood ran cold. You don't tell a combat jet on bingo fuel, meaning they have exactly enough fuel to land, not a drop more for a go-around, to hold and climb. Negative, tower! The military pilot's voice was breaking an octave higher, panic bleeding through the trained discipline. I have 3 minutes of fuel remaining in my tanks. My wingman is on fumes. If you do not give me a vector, we are going to punch out and let these airframes fall on your town. Give me a heading. The radio went dead. Miller had frozen. The silence in the FBO was suffocating. Arthur took a step toward the desk. He was a civilian captain. He didn't know the approach speeds of a Hornet, but he knew he couldn't let those kids die while Miller panicked. He reached for the heavy handheld transceiver that sat on the counter, used by the FBO to talk to the tower and the emergency guard frequencies. He never made it. A hand clamped down on the radio before he could touch it. Arthur looked up, startled. It was Helen, but it wasn't the Helen he knew. The slump in her shoulders was completely gone. Her spine was rigid. The mousy, apologetic look in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, terrifying focus. It was a look Arthur had only seen once or twice in his life, usually on the faces of men who had seen things they couldn't talk about. She didn't look at Arthur. She keyed the microphone. When she spoke, the whisper was gone. Her voice was a whip crack. It was flat, mechanical, and saturated with absolute authority. Outlaw 1-1, this is Red Mesa Base. Disregard tower. I have your track. Turn left heading 180. Descend and maintain 3,000 feet. You have a 10-mile straight in for runway 19er. There was a split-second pause on the radio. The military pilot, likely shocked by the sudden change in voice and competence, responded instantly to the tone of command. 180, descending to 3,000. Base, my wingman is flaming out. He just lost his right engine. Helen didn't blink. Her hands moved over the FBO's secondary radar screen, pushing aside a stack of mundane invoices to clear her view of the green blips. Copy that. Outlaw 1-1. 1-2. If you are single engine, you are now flight lead. 1-1. Drop back and trail. 1-2. Keep your speed up through the turbulence. Do not flare early. The wind is sheer at 200 feet. You will drop like a stone. Keep the power in until your rubber hits the concrete. Arthur stood frozen. He looked around the room. The corporate pilots were staring at the desk clerk with their mouths open. Todd, the line mechanic, looked like he was going to pass out. Helen was operating on a different plane of existence. The terminology, the pacing, the absolute lack of hesitation. She was feeding the terrified pilots exactly what they needed. She was pulling them out of the sky by the sheer force of her will. The base, 1-2, the second pilot choked out. I'm dropping through 2,000. I don't have the runway. I don't see anything. Trust your instruments, 1-2, Helen snapped back, her voice projecting across the room like a physical force. You are on the glide slope. I am painting you right on the center line. Do not look outside. Look at your needles. 3 miles out. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Arthur watched Helen's eyes. They were fixed on the radar screen, but he knew she wasn't seeing the green sweep. She was in the cockpit with them. She was feeling the shudder of the airframe, the heavy, sluggish response of a dying jet. 2 miles, Helen commanded. 1-2, you have a hung gear. Prepare for directional loss on touchdown. Stick into the wind, heavy on the left brake the second you feel the weight settle. Do not try to save the jet. Save yourself. Copy. Stick into the wind. 1 mile. Altitude is 100. You are on the money. 1-2. Keep it coming. Outside, the wind shrieked. A massive crack of thunder rattled the windows. Over the threshold, Helen said softly, her lips barely moving. Cut power. Plant it. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but static on the radio. No screech of tires. No explosion, just the hiss of the dead airwaves. Arthur realized he wasn't breathing. He looked at Helen. She was staring straight ahead. The microphone held inches from her mouth. Then, a ragged, exhausted voice cracked through the speaker. Base, Outlaw 1-2 is down. We are on the dirt off the left side of 19er, but we are down safe. I'm shutting down the left engine. Outlaw 11 is rolling out behind me. A collective breath rushed out of the men in the FBO. One of the corporate pilots let out a shaky laugh. Helen slowly released the transmit button on the microphone. She set the heavy radio back down on its cradle. The rigidity in her spine slowly dissolved. Her shoulders slumped. She reached up and nervously adjusted the plastic clip in her hair. She looked at Arthur. The steel in her eyes was gone, replaced by the familiar, tired emptiness. I'll go make a fresh pot of coffee, Helen murmured, her voice barely a whisper again. She turned and walked toward the break room. Arthur stood by the counter, the silence ringing in his ears, realizing that for the past 6 months, they hadn't been making the desk clerk get their coffee. They had been making a ghost fetch their coffee. And the ghost was a goddamn fighter pilot. The storm broke 2 hours later, leaving behind a cold, sharp stillness. The runway was a sea of flashing red and amber lights. Crash tenders, military police cruisers, and base command vehicles swarmed the dirt patch where the 2 crippled F-18s rested in the mud. Inside the FBO, the silence was thicker than the storm had been. Nobody drank the coffee Helen made. Todd was staring at his phone, pretending not to look at her. The corporate pilots had retreated to opposite corners of the room, speaking in hushed, nervous tones. Arthur remained in his leather chair. He watched Helen. She was back behind the counter, methodically aligning a stack of rental car brochures. She smoothed the edges over and over, her fingers trembling slightly. The front doors banged open. 3 men in olive drab flight suits walked in, trailing rainwater onto the linoleum. 2 of them were young, pale, and vibrating with leftover adrenaline. The third was older, his hair clipped to the scalp, wearing the silver oak leaves of a Navy commander on his chest. The lead pilot, a kid who couldn't have been older than 25, his face flushed and his hands shaking, scanned the room. "Who was on the radio?" he demanded. His voice was raspy, stripped raw from screaming into an oxygen mask. Nobody answered. Todd swallowed hard and looked at the floor. Arthur slowly stood up. "I said, who was on the radio?" the young pilot asked again, stepping toward the center of the room. "Tower transferred us to a base frequency. Someone talked us down." "Who was it?" Helen kept her head down. She picked up a staple gun and began refilling it. The metal click-clack was the only sound in the room. The older commander's eyes swept past Arthur, past the corporate pilots, and landed on the woman in the oversized beige cardigan. He froze. The color drained from his weathered face. He took a slow step toward the counter. "I don't believe it," the commander said. His voice was barely a whisper. Helen stopped loading the staple gun. She didn't look up. The commander walked right up to the desk. He didn't look at the name tag pinned to her cardigan. He looked at the way she stood. "Major Brody," he said. Helen finally raised her head. The empty, vacant look she wore for the line mechanics was gone. Her eyes were hard, flat, and impossibly tired. "I work the desk, Commander," she replied, her tone neutral. "I don't hold rank." "You talked my boys down," the commander said, gesturing to the 2 young pilots behind him. "You pulled a blind approach out of your ass in a micro-burst, with a hung gear. Tower was overwhelmed. The radio was open. I just relayed the glide slope." "Bullshit!" The commander leaned heavily against the Formica counter. "You commanded that frequency. You always did. I thought you were dead, Helen, or living in a cabin in Montana. Nobody has seen you since Kandahar." Arthur pulled out his phone. He walked to the window, pretending to check the weather radar. He typed, "Helen Brody Kandahar," into the search bar. The results populated instantly. He didn't need to read the long-form articles. The headlines and the brief snippets were enough. Military record: H. Brody. Branch: United States Marine Corps. Aircraft: F-18. Hornet: EA-18G Growler. Call sign: Wraith. Service: highlights: lead instructor at Top Gun, Fallon. 3 combat deployments. Incident: 2018. Night close air support mission over Kandahar. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. Wingman suffered catastrophic engine failure. Brody maintained position, guided her wingman through a blind descent into a blackout landing zone while actively suppressing ground fire. Wingman survived. Brody was grounded a week later for extreme combat fatigue and auditory processing burnout. Arthur locked his phone. He understood now. You don't walk away from that kind of stress unscarred. The human nervous system is basically a set of copper wires. Run too much voltage through them for too long, and the insulation melts. Helen hadn't lost her nerve. She had just burned out her wires. She came to a quiet desert town, took a job that required nothing from her, and wrapped herself in a beige cardigan to hide from the sky. "Thank you, ma'am," the young pilot suddenly said. He stepped up beside the commander. He was trembling. "I was dead. We were both dead. I couldn't see the nose of my own jet." "You flew the plane, Lieutenant," Helen said quietly. "I just read the numbers. Check your left main strut before they tow it. You hit hard." "Why are you here, Helen?" the commander asked, ignoring his junior officer. "Filing receipts? Wiping down coffee pots? You were the best stick in the squadron." Helen looked at the commander for a long, heavy moment. She didn't offer a dramatic speech. She didn't talk about ghosts or trauma or the burden of command. "The coffee pots don't bleed, sir," she said flatly. "And they don't ask me to save them." The commander held her gaze, nodding slowly. He understood. He tapped his knuckles twice on the counter, a quiet gesture of deep respect, turned and led his pilots out of the FBO. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. The room felt entirely too small. Todd was staring at Helen with his mouth open. The corporate pilots were awkwardly shuffling their feet. The invisibility cloak was gone. Helen looked down at the rental brochures. She pushed them into a neat pile, turned around, and walked into the back office. The next morning, the desert sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The air smelled of wet sage and aviation fuel. Arthur's flight was scheduled to depart at Oro 900. He arrived at the FBO an hour early. The heavy equipment from the military base was already out on the runway, hooking cables to the mud-caked Hornets to tow them back through the perimeter gate. He found Helen in the parking lot. She wasn't wearing the cardigan. She had on a plain white t-shirt, jeans, and a faded olive-drab canvas jacket. She was tossing a small cardboard box into the trunk of a beat-up 2008 Honda Civic. The paint on the rear bumper was peeling. Arthur walked over. He carried a stainless steel thermos. "FBO coffee is garbage," Arthur said, extending a paper cup toward her. "I bring my own, French roast, black." Helen looked at the cup, then at Arthur. She took it. The tremor in her hands was gone. "Thanks," she said, taking a sip. She let out a long exhale. "That is better." "You quitting?" Arthur asked, nodding toward the cardboard box in her trunk. "Fired, actually," she replied, leaning against the dusty trunk of the Civic. Base manager came in this morning. The military filed an official report about a civilian operating an emergency frequency. Major FCC violation. The manager was terrified of losing his government fuel contract. Gave me 2 weeks severance and told me to clear out, Arthur scoffed. You saved 2 airframes and 2 lives. They should give you a medal. I have enough medals, Helen said. She stared out across the chain-link fence, watching the tow trucks dragging the broken jets across the concrete. They just gathered dust. They stood in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet, unspoken language of people who had spent thousands of hours locked in aluminum tubes at 30,000 feet, isolated from the rest of the world. Where will you go? Arthur asked. Don't know, Helen said. She traced the rim of the paper cup with her thumb. Somewhere landlocked, somewhere without a runway. Maybe I'll get a job in a library. People whisper in libraries. I like whispering. You're a good pilot, Helen, Arthur said softly. The instinct doesn't go away. You proved that yesterday. Helen turned her head and looked at him. The desert sun caught the sharp angles of her face, highlighting the deep lines around her eyes. Lines carved by G-forces and sleep deprivation. Being a good pilot isn't about instinct, she said. It's about bandwidth. You have a finite amount of space in your head to process data, fear, geometry, and responsibility. Once that space is full, it's full. Yesterday, I had just enough bandwidth left to get those kids on the ground. But if I had to do it again today, I'd crash them. Arthur nodded. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He knew she was telling the truth. You can only redline an engine so many times before the block cracks. Well, Arthur said, extending his hand. It was an honor flying your airspace, Major. Helen looked at his hand. She reached out and gripped it firmly. Her hands were calloused, strong. The hands of a woman who used to wrestle 50,000 pounds of thrust through the sound barrier. Safe skies, Captain, she said. She got into the Honda Civic. The engine whined in protest before turning over, settling into a rough idle. She put it in gear and drove slowly out of the parking lot, joining the 2-lane highway that cut through the scrub brush. She didn't look back at the airfield. Arthur watched her car shrink to a dot against the horizon. He threw his empty paper cup into a trash can and walked toward the tarmac. His bombardier was waiting. The mechanics had cleared the starboard engine. The passengers were probably already complaining about the legroom in the terminal. He walked up the air stairs and stepped into the cramped, familiar cockpit. He sat in the left seat, strapped himself in, and began his pre-flight checklist. Battery switch, APU on, hydraulic pumps. He reached up to key the radio to call for clearance. He paused. He looked out the reinforced window, staring at the empty patch of sky where the hornets had dropped out of the clouds the day before. He thought about the woman in the beige cardigan. He thought about the invisible geometry she saw in the air, the heavy burden she carried in her mind, and the quiet, terrible cost of being the person everyone relies on when the sky falls. Arthur toggled the frequency. Red Mesa ground, this is flight 4482. Ready for taxi. 4482, ground. Taxi via Alpha, hold short of runway 19er. Arthur pushed the throttles forward. The plane lurched, rolling toward the runway. It was just another routine flight. Another metal tube carrying people who had no idea how thin the line was between the ground and the sky. But Arthur knew. He would always know. The sky wasn't just empty air, it was full of ghosts. And sometimes, if you paid attention, you could hear them pulling you home. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in the FBO that day? Don't forget to share this video with a friend who appreciates deeply human stories, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, original storytelling every single week. Your support keeps these stories flying. Thank you for watching.